The Dark Tower, Book 1, The Gunslinger, by Stephen King. Book review. So believe it or not, this is the first Stephen King book I've read, or at least the first Stephen King novel I've read. I read his book on writing, which is just kind of him talking about the style of writing or giving advice on how to write well. But I've never read any of his novels. Why not? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I like a good horror story as much as anyone. I'm fascinated by horror and ghosts and everything, just like the next person. I don't know why I never got around to reading him before. So, not having much of a basis of comparison, I can't really say whether this book was a typical Stephen King novel or not. But I get the feeling it's not. Bit of an interesting history behind this book, which is kind of covered in the author's introduction. Stephen King originally wrote this book when he was 19, but he didn't get it published much later until after he became famous. So it was published in 1982 for the first time. The edition I read was the one published in 2003, which has been expanded and revised by Stephen King and also has kind of a new author's introduction to it. I found this a bit of a difficult read, actually, which surprised me because I always think of kind of Stephen King as like, you know, the king of the supermarket novel. All these kind of trashy, sorry, not trashy, but very popular and accessible books. In the author's introduction to the revised edition, King explains some of this. He says, quote, "I should say a word about the younger man who dared to write this book. That young man had been exposed to far too many writing seminars and had grown far too used to the ideas those seminars promulgate. That one is writing for other people rather than oneself. That language is more important than story. That ambiguity is to be preferred over clarity and simplicity, which are usually signs of a thick and literal mind. As a result, I was not surprised to find a high degree of pretension in Roland's debut appearance." So this might account for the confusing nature of the book. On the other hand, King goes on to say that he cleaned up as much of that junk as he could in the revised edition. So it's difficult to know as you're reading this book, which Stephen King are you actually reading? Are you reading the 19-year-old Stephen King, or the 1982 Stephen King when the book was originally published, or the 2003 Stephen King when he went back and revised and cleaned it up, or I don't know. It's a shame it's a difficult read because I think the people who would most enjoy this book are kind of younger readers. You know, kind of people who are 12, 13, 14. Now, it's a violent book, so they wouldn't want their parents to know they were reading it. But I think the general story would be most appealing to that kind of age of readers. But I don't know, I found it a little bit hard going to read through. So I don't know if I would have stuck with this book when I was 13 or 14 or 15. I don't know. The plot of the book, at least as far as the main story, the forward story goes, is very simple. In fact, I think I could summarize everything that happens in a couple paragraphs. I'm not going to, I mean, it's all on Wikipedia, right? If you want to find out the story, you can just go to Wikipedia. What's confusing about this story and what makes it more complex is the backstory. So, who is the gunslinger? Where does he come from? Why is he on this quest? Now, the backstory is hinted at and it's given in pieces throughout the book, but when you get to the end of the book, when you get to the last page of book 1, the reader still doesn't really know what's going on. Who is the gunslinger? Where does he come from? these are all still questions left open at the end of the book. Now, this is a series. I've said in the past, I don't like it when books end on a cliffhanger. If I buy a book, I want it to be self-contained. I'm a little bit more forgiving of this because this is obviously an epic series, so it needs to be split up over several books. But it frustrates me that even after finishing this whole book, I still don't really know what's going on. I mean, I could handle it if I didn't know what the conclusion of the book was. But it frustrates me that I don't even know what the backstory is yet. I don't even know what's really going on here. I guess that's all the more reason for me to buy the next book in this series and kind of see where it's going. Or maybe not. You see, like, remember I mentioned that I had read Stephen King's book On Writing first? See, in that On Writing book, he talks about how he believes all the best stories are made up as you go. Which means presumably he's making this story up as he goes. Which, does that include the backstory? Is he still making the backstory up as he goes? I don't know. In his book On Writing, King claims that all the best stories are made up as you go, because that makes them seem real and it makes the characters seem real. And it makes a story driven by the characters. So like King's theory is if you start off with a plot, then you have to just kind of manipulate the characters to get them to follow the plot. But if you start off with just organic characters, then the writer just kind of follows those characters naturally as they go. And maybe he's right. I don't know. At the same time, though, as a reader, it spoils the illusion for me because I like to believe that the author always has everything perfectly planned out. I'm not sure if I could do it myself, but I like to believe that other authors do. Just my illusion as a reader. So, yeah, I don't know now if I feel a need to continue with this. If it turns out that King doesn't have any of this plotted in advance and he's just making this up as he goes along, maybe I could just make up the backstory myself then, rather than feel a need to kind of stick with the rest of these series. I don't know. I might just stop here and not continue with the series.